My grandmother, Nana Ruth, had a root cellar behind the farmhouse. It smelled like earth and salt and smoke. I used to hate going down there as a kid. Now I'd give anything to spend one more afternoon watching what she did in that cellar. She grew up 2 counties over from an Amish community in central Ohio. Their families farmed the same hills for generations. They talked, they traded, and somewhere along the way, Nana Ruth learned how those Amish families kept meat through winter, through summer, through years, without electricity, without refrigerators, without anything from a factory. I'm Dale Porter. I grew up on 200 acres in Ohio, my father's farm, his father's farm before that, and I spent 10 years cooking in restaurant kitchens in Columbus before I came back here. I've processed a lot of meat. I've stood in a lot of walk-in coolers. I know how modern food preservation works. And I'm telling you right now, what those Amish families were doing is more sophisticated than most people realize. This isn't about living off the grid because it's trendy. This is about knowledge that kept people alive for centuries. Knowledge that the industrial food system spent the last 80 years trying to make you forget. Because if you know how to preserve your own meat for 2 years without a freezer, you don't need their products. You don't need their packaging. You don't need their markup. Let me show you what Nana Ruth learned from those neighbors. And let me show you the science behind why every single one of these methods actually works. The first thing you have to understand is why meat spoils at all. Bacteria are everywhere. They're on the surface of every cut of meat the moment it hits open air. Most bacteria that spoil food, Listeria, Salmonella, Clostridium, they need moisture, oxygen, and the right temperature range to multiply. Remove any one of those 3 things effectively, and you stop the clock. That's not folk wisdom, that's microbiology. The Amish figured this out through observation and practice long before anyone named bacteria. Salt curing is the oldest method on this list. It's also the one most people think they understand but don't. Here's what's actually happening when you pack meat in salt. Salt draws moisture out of the meat through osmosis. The cells of bacteria, just like your own cells, lose water in a high salt environment. They shrink. They stop functioning. They die. At the same time, the salt penetrates the meat itself, lowering the water activity inside the muscle tissue. Water activity is the measurement of how much free water is available for microbial growth. Get it low enough, below 0.85, and most dangerous bacteria can't multiply. Nana Ruth used a dry cure. She'd mix coarse, non-iodized salt, a small amount of brown sugar, and black pepper. That was it. No curing salts from a package, no sodium nitrite. The ratio she used was roughly 1 pound of coarse salt to every 10 pounds of meat, sometimes a little more for thicker cuts like pork shoulder or ham. She'd rub it in by hand, making sure every surface was covered. Then she'd pack the meat tight in a crock, ceramic, not metal because metal reacts, and set it in the cold part of the cellar. Now here's what the Amish neighbors taught her that she didn't know at first. You have to check the brine that forms. After 3 or 4 days, the salt pulls so much moisture out of the meat that it creates its own liquid, a natural brine. You want that brine to run clear. If it starts to smell sour or look cloudy, you repack the meat with fresh salt. That's the quality check. That's the thing most modern guides skip entirely. Thin cuts, bacon strips, pork belly slabs, are cured in about a week. Thick cuts like a full ham can take 3 to 4 weeks. Temperature matters here. You want the cellar or storage area to stay between 35 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Below freezing and the curing process slows too much. Above 55 for extended periods, and you risk bacterial growth faster than the salt can do its job. The Amish time their slaughtering for late fall, November, for exactly this reason. The weather did half the work. After curing, the meat has to be dried, hung in a space with good airflow. Not wet air, not outdoor summer air. The surface needs to form what's called a pellicle, a dry, slightly tacky skin. That skin is a barrier. It's what keeps contamination from re-entering the meat after the cure. Nana Ruth hung cuts from hooks in the ceiling of the smokehouse. She'd leave them 2 to 3 days before smoking. Don't skip this step. This is where a lot of home curers go wrong and then wonder why their product doesn't hold. Smoke curing comes next, and this is where people get confused because there are 2 completely different things called smoke curing: cold smoking and hot smoking. Hot smoking cooks the meat. Cold smoking preserves it. They are not the same process. They do not produce the same result. If you want meat that lasts months to years, you are talking about cold smoking. Cold smoking happens below 80 degrees Fahrenheit, ideally between 60 and 70. You're exposing the surface of the meat to smoke compounds, phenols, aldehydes, acids, that penetrate the pellicle and create an antimicrobial barrier. Smoke kills surface bacteria. It slows oxidation of the fats. It creates a low oxygen environment right at the surface, and it dries the meat further, continuing to reduce that water activity. The Amish built their smokehouses with the firebox at the bottom and the meat hung high. The smoke cooled as it rose. They ran cold smoke for 12 to 14 hours a day, over 3 to 5 days, depending on the cut. The wood mattered. Hickory was the most common in Ohio, applewood for a milder flavor, cherry for a slight sweetness. What they never used was resinous wood, pine, spruce, cedar. Resinous smoke deposits creosote on the meat. That's not flavor, that's toxins. Never use softwood in a smokehouse. Nana Ruth told me the Amish women could look at a ham after smoking and tell by the color whether it was done. A deep mahogany with a dry, firm surface, that's what you're looking for. If it's still tacky and pale, it needs more time. These women had been doing this since they were children. Their mothers taught them. Their grandmothers taught their mothers. That's the kind of knowledge that doesn't fit in a recipe card. Now I want to stop for a second and talk about food safety in real terms. Not to scare you, to equip you. Because there are people out there who will tell you home curing is dangerous. And there are people on the other side who will tell you salt cures everything and nothing bad can happen. Both of those people are wrong. The real risk in cured and smoked meats, particularly in an anaerobic environment, is Clostridium botulinum, botulism. This is not a joke. Botulism toxin is one of the most potent toxins that exists. The bacteria that produce it are anaerobic. They thrive without oxygen, which means any preserved meat that gets sealed away from air needs to be processed correctly. Salt curing alone, if done with sufficient salt concentration and kept at proper temperature, creates an environment where C. botulinum cannot grow. The key word is sufficient. Don't guess at ratios. Use 1 pound of coarse non-iodized salt per 10 pounds of meat minimum for dry cure. For brine curing, you want a solution strong enough that a raw potato floats. That's roughly 10% brine by weight. The Amish used salt ratios that were established through generations of safe use. They weren't guessing. They'd seen what happens when it goes wrong. They were more careful about this, not less careful, than most modern home cooks who treat the refrigerator as a backup for sloppy technique. If you are ever in doubt, if a cured meat smells wrong, looks wrong, has an off color or a slimy texture, don't taste it to check. Throw it out. Salt preservation works when done correctly. It fails when the ratios are wrong or the temperature conditions weren't maintained. That's the honest truth. Now let's talk about lard packing. This method, called confit in French cooking, but the Amish had their own version long before the word traveled to Ohio, is one of the most elegant preservation methods ever developed. The principle is simple. Fat is anaerobic. Bacteria need moisture and oxygen. Submerge cooked meat completely in rendered animal fat and you cut off both. The meat stays preserved for months, even over a year, without refrigeration in a cool cellar. The Amish rendered lard from their own pigs, nothing from a store. Rendered lard has a very long shelf life on its own, particularly if it's been properly clarified. They'd cook pork, usually shoulder, sometimes whole sausages, until it was fully cooked through. Then they'd pack it hot into crocks and pour the hot rendered lard over it until the meat was completely submerged, with at least a ½ inch of fat above the surface. As it cooled, the lard hardened. It created a sealed cap. No air could reach the meat below. Nana Ruth called this putting meat up in fat. She had crocks in the cellar that she'd set in October and open in March. 5 months. She'd lift the fat cap, pull out a piece of pork, and pan fry it. It was, by every account I ever heard, incredible. The fat protected the meat and also kept it moist. None of the drying you get from long-cured hams. Just tender, preserved pork. The temperature requirements for lard packing are similar to salt curing. Below 50 degrees for long-term storage. A root cellar that stays between 35 and 48 degrees is ideal. Above 55 for extended periods and the fat can begin to turn rancid, which compromises the seal. If your fat smells rancid, your protection is gone. The Amish dug their cellars deep, 8 to 10 feet, specifically because at that depth, soil temperature in Ohio stays between 40 and 55 degrees year-round. Passive refrigeration. No electricity required. I want you to understand the engineering involved in a properly built root cellar, because this is what the Amish built, and this is what made everything else possible. They dug into a north-facing slope when they could. Less sun exposure means lower soil temperature. They vented the cellar with 2 pipes, one low on the north side bringing cool air in, one high on the south side letting warm air out. Natural convection. The temperature inside stayed remarkably consistent. Humidity stayed between 85 and 95%, which kept root vegetables and certain cured meats from drying out too fast. They understood this through observation of what worked and what didn't over generations. If you don't have access to a full root cellar, you can approximate these conditions. A basement corner that stays cool, test it with a thermometer over a week. a buried cooler or insulated box in shaded soil. Even a garage in northern states that doesn't freeze hard can work for short-term storage. The temperature and humidity requirements are the critical variable. Everything else can be adapted. Vinegar preservation is the fourth method, and it's the most misunderstood. People think of pickled meat as strange, as old-fashioned, as something nobody would want to eat. That's because they've never had it done right. Vinegar creates an acidic environment, low pH, that prevents bacterial growth. Most bacteria that spoil food or cause illness cannot survive below a pH of 4.6. A 5% apple cider vinegar brine, which is standard, brings food down to around pH 3.4. That's uninhabitable for almost everything dangerous. The Amish use vinegar primarily for offal and tougher cuts that didn't cure as well. Heart, tongue, beef cheeks. The meat was cooked first, brined or boiled, then packed in crocks with a hot vinegar solution, often with spices. Whole peppercorns, bay leaf, mustard seed, what we'd call head cheese or pickled tongue today. These products kept without refrigeration for 3 to 4 months in a cool cellar. Nana Ruth made pickled pig's feet every fall, sat in a vinegar brine in a ceramic crock on the cellar shelf. She'd eat them through February. The important safety note with vinegar preservation is that you need to maintain that acidity consistently. Don't dilute the vinegar with too much water. Don't add too many low-acid ingredients, like extra onions or garlic, without adjusting. If your brine tastes genuinely sharp and sour, it's doing its job. If it tastes mild or sweet, you need more acid. Here's what I keep coming back to when I think about all of this. My father's generation was the first to grow up entirely dependent on the electric grid for food preservation. My grandfather still remembered curing. My grandmother Nana Ruth still practiced it. My father thought it was old-fashioned. He bought a chest freezer in 1972 and considered the problem solved. And then there was a bad ice storm in 2003. Power was out for 11 days across our county. We lost $600 worth of meat from that freezer. My father stood in the driveway watching it go into the dumpster. That was the conversation where Nana Ruth, who was still alive then, said, very quietly, "My mother would not have understood this problem." She wasn't being cruel. She was pointing at something real. The knowledge that kept people fed through every winter and drought and crop failure for generations. We chose to replace it with electricity and plastic and cold chain logistics. And when those fail, we have nothing. No backup, no skill set, no memory. The Amish communities kept the knowledge because they chose to keep it. Not out of stubbornness, out of a very clear-eyed assessment of what dependence costs. They saw what happened to families who outsourced everything to systems they didn't control. They decided that wasn't going to be them. I'm not telling you to join an Amish community. I'm telling you the knowledge is real, it works, and it's worth learning. Every year, power outages get longer. Every year, grocery prices go up. Every year, more people start wondering whether the system they've been trusting is as reliable as they thought. Dry salt curing, cold smoking, lard packing, vinegar preservation, root cellar management, these are not primitive techniques. They are sophisticated, time-tested methods that produce excellent food and genuine long-term food security. Nana Ruth would have laughed at how much people pay for freeze-dried survival food. She'd have laughed and then offered you a slice of salt-cured ham that had been hanging in the smokehouse since October, and you would not have complained. The industrial food people do not want you knowing this. They want you dependent on refrigeration, on their packaging, on their supply chains. Because the moment you know how to put meat up for 2 years without electricity, you stop being a customer for a whole category of products. You stop being afraid of the power going out. You stop panicking when there's a shortage. That's the kind of freedom they're not particularly interested in selling you. This technique is older than most of the stuff they sell at the grocery store. The chemistry hasn't changed. Salt still draws out moisture. Smoke still kills surface bacteria. Fat still creates an anaerobic seal. Acid still drops pH below survival thresholds for pathogens. None of this is magic. All of it is real. Learn one method this year. Start with dry salt curing. It's the simplest and the most forgiving. Get a ceramic crock. Get good, coarse, non-iodized salt. Find a cool corner of your basement. Cure a pork belly. Give it a week. See what you made. Then learn the next one. Nana Ruth didn't learn all of this at once. She learned it over years, watching her Amish neighbors, asking questions, making mistakes, tasting results. She built that knowledge the same way every generation before her did. Slowly, practically, hands-on. That knowledge almost disappeared. Her kids didn't learn it. I almost didn't learn it. I had to dig through her notes and drive out to talk to older families who still remembered. But it's not gone. Not yet. And it doesn't have to be. If you want to go deeper on any of these methods, the specific ratios for dry cure, how to build a cold smoker from scratch, how to set up a root cellar on a tight budget, Let me know in the comments. I'll put together detailed follow-ups for each one. And if you've got family knowledge like this, a grandmother who cured meat, a grandfather who smoked fish, an old neighbor who showed you something that seemed strange at the time, share it. Write it down. That stuff is worth more than it looks. Nana Ruth kept a notebook. Spiral-bound, water-stained, handwriting I can barely read. In it, she recorded every batch of cured meat she ever made. The date, the weight, the salt ratio, the temperature, the result. 5 decades of data. 5 decades of knowledge built one batch at a time. That notebook is one of the most valuable things I own. Not because it's worth anything to anyone else, because it's proof that ordinary people, paying attention, can learn to do extraordinary things. Don't let this stuff disappear. Learn it, use it, teach someone. The cellar door is open.